Welcome guys to the Oniro session. My name is Davide and I'm the director of the Open Source Technology Center for Huawei in Europe. And we just started, take your time. And I'm here to tell you how we have designed Oniro so that it can become a production, close enough?
A little bit closer, thanks.
So that it can become a production-oriented OS for all kinds of devices. It can be used for thanks.
Ooh,
in production. So if you want to build a product or anything which is production oriented, we need to ask ourselves the question, who we're targeting, right? Who are our customers? There's two types of customers for Oniro, what we call indirect customers and direct customers. Direct partners or indirect partners, if you will, who are we targeting? So directly, Oniro is designed for end users. So each and every one of us in this room. And directly, it's designed for application and content creators and device makers. Right? So this is the triad, if you will. Device maker puts devices in production for end users to buy. Application and content creators create application and content for users to use. And it's this kind of pull and push effects between these three actors. And indirectly, there's hardware vendors that device makers use to power their devices. There's operating system vendors that can build their services and value-add commercial services for an open source operating system such as Oniro, and system integrators. These are consultant company, services company. They integrate, they design on behalf of third parties. Right? So directly and indirectly. And we're going to be focusing on the direct part because these have been the actors that we've been interviewing and we have had in mind as we build Oniro. Right, so when we started this journey a couple of years ago, 3 almost, we were in this kind of pickle, right? If you guys come from a programming language or programming background, you guys should be familiar with the dining philosopher, deadlock, right? So we're building something for device makers, but device makers need users. If users don't buy devices with Oniro on it, why should I put Oniro on my device? But user can't buy devices because they're not in store, and application creators don't build application for devices not created by device makers the user wouldn't buy. So how do we go about fix this? Where do we start, right? And thankfully there is a solution to this. So the solution is that device makers, they have pain points, and we'll get to that in a second. But the answer to this question lies in the production-oriented words, right? The pain points that device makers have is that when they build their devices, they deal with technology fragmentation. I've dealt with many device makers. I've been in this business for 15 plus years, and we had device makers with 20 product line, and none of those product line use the same underlying OS. It's all very similar, but never enough identical to create efficiency and scale. They do have on the other side, pre-existing investment. Sometimes the switching from one technology to another can happen because there's pre-existing investment in terms of code, tools, infrastructure, legacy tools, and so forth, right? And third, they find themselves overspending in what is a commodity area. Like, why would you invent a new operating system, right? There's many out there. It's not about the technology itself, it's about the ecosystem, it's about the positioning of it, right? But they're over-investing in a commodity area, and they're on this underspending in value add. It is very common to find device makers having 15, 20, 25 engineers allocated to develop and design the operating system for each of the product lines that they have, when they could create efficiency by either creating what they call a common platform group, or even better, participating in an open source project to build something that is production oriented for them. So why did this happen? Why open source has existed for many years? And we talked about Linux and Zephyr and FreeRTOS, but there's still this huge amount of money spent in reinventing the wheel, if you will. Because open source so far has had a role of innovation effectively. So think of open source as innovation engine. Right, it spins new technology features and functionality really fast, right, so that you can be on the edge. it is developers oriented. So code, documentation, tutorials are addressing not the CFO of a company. They are not addressing the CMO of a company. They're not addressing who makes a product. They are addressing the developers. They're making the life of developers to create new features and new products much easier. But that's just a small portion of the cost that is invested when you build a product, right? And we'll see that later. So effectively, open source has played a role of allowing device makers to achieve a faster time to market. I can deliver new products to the market in a faster way, not necessarily cheaper, and it has lowered the cost of expertise. If you go back to the 1990s, when you looked at Microsoft CE or VxWorks, big RTOSes used in devices, the cost of a professional service engineer could actually be in $2K, $3K a day, if you will, if not even more. Now, leveraging Linux, Zephyr, free RTOS, which is so available to everybody and every developers to learn, has decreased the cost per hour of a developer. So open source has really addressed one teeny tiny small problem that a device maker has, which is cranking out devices faster and cheaper labor. That's what's done. But what it is production-oriented open source? What if we are to address the other part of the cost that device makers still face and they don't have a solution for it? And this is why we came up with the idea of a production-oriented open source. So production-oriented open source, it's something that provides a predictable roadmap. If I'm a device maker and I need to build an OS into my devices, I want to know at what time each release with which features are going to come to market. Otherwise, I cannot trust that project to build my devices with it. It has to have a predictable life cycle. If I want to invest and take an open source project, participating, put that project into my devices, how long is that going to be around? How many years can I count on a specific release to be maintained, bug fixes and security fixes? So that's what we call life cycle predictability. It doesn't have to present itself as a collection of libraries only. It has to come with what we call opinionated defaults. So when you combine together building blocks, they don't just stick together because you throw each other, at each other out. They stick together because you have assembled the image and selected defaults on the way that you do security, whitelisting versus blacklisting, on the way that you do a read-only or read-and-write file system, right? The size of the file system itself, which drivers you load at boot time, built into the kernel or after the kernel has booted as a module. These are what we call opinionated defaults. And then production-oriented open source doesn't necessarily only focus on developing feature, but it does focus on continuous integration, if you will, deployment, validation, and compliance. If I'm a device maker and I'm the R&D department and I take an innovation-oriented project, I still had to do license compliant, export compliant, testing and verification, release note, product note, and generating all of the artifacts that my CPO will be able to stamp and say, this is production ready, right? And so that's what a production-oriented project such as Oniro has to do to address the pain point of device makers. And in the end, a production-oriented open source project has to come with a compliance envelope. That's how we call it. So it has to come with production artifacts such as VFV report, performance report, software bill of material. Mike talked about this morning with openchain and OpenSFF, right? These are very important things that open source hasn't built into the open source development way so far. So remember where we started? The dining philosopher, end user, device makers, and application creators. Where do we start from? We thought that we had a pretty significant value to deliver with Oniro to device makers. And by starting with device makers, if you will, in a B2B fashion, we could get the ball rolling, devices shipped, and then user to consume Oniro, and application be created. So going back a bit to the cost, if open source so far for OSs has addressed about 20% of the cost, that's R&D, the 80% of the other costs are that production-oriented set of compliance artifact and continuous development and testing and verification, right? So we're trying to address that 80% of the cost. And it's funny because when I came out of engineering school, whenever you build a system, an engineering system, you're taught that the cost of designing the system is 80 and the cost of maintaining the system is 20 over time. Well, what's funny is that with software is the other way around. The cost of designing the system and developing features, especially when you leverage open source, is about 20% of the overall cost of an operating system over the life cycle, and 80% is the cost of maintaining and productizing it over the life cycle of a device. So at Oniro, we try to address the ice that is under the water. 20% cost of development, 80% cost of production altogether. And that's something which is new. And that's why device makers come and talk to us and love what the project is doing. So we call Oniro a production-oriented open source. When members join the Oniro project and contribute their features, they also share the cost of all of the operation activities of this production-oriented project. They share the cost of maintenance, for instance. They can decide that one release is going to be alive for 3 years, and another release doesn't have any production device, so no point in maintaining it, right? So they share all of the cost and influence in creating this production-oriented set of practices and decision-making. They share the roadmap. What kind of functionalities are going to be officially supported versus experimental? And you'll see a bit later, right? But it's very important. Think about that. If I had 10 members at the table of the steering committee and PMC and marketing committee, and it's about sharing cost of a default or a cost of maintaining a release, they all had to agree whether or not a specific feature or driver or supported hardware is officially supported or not, because supporting 10 reference hardware is going to cost more than supporting 2 officially supported reference hardware. So these are all things that typically are done when you start moving in production. Product managers do this. They tend to look at what is the minimum effort to achieve the broadest market possible. But this is all something that all the members and community developers inside Oniro do on a daily basis, because we're now geared toward production-oriented OS. And they choose common opinionated defaults: read-write file system, read-only file system, blacklisting or whitelisting in security. This production-oriented project and production-oriented decisions are all things that are discussed inside the Oniro project. It's not only about which kernel do you choose and which compiler do we choose and which drivers do we enable, but what is supported, what is experimental, for how long, what kind of artifacts do we build, what is the format of the compliance artifacts, SPDX or not, and so forth. And they share the cost of CI and CD and compliance envelope. And at the end of the day, this leads to a project that delivers not only the reference image and the software, but a set of artifacts that if you pass on to your legal department or marketing at any company that participates and adopts the project, can be immediately used into production. Right? So that's the idea. Well, and importantly, of course, this is aligned to pre-existing investment. And I was forgetting about this, but this is very important. I'll get to that in a second. Why is this important? Why is this important that everything that we do has to be aligned with pre-existing investment? Well, something might be cool, might be great, but if it costs me 2 years to switch from the old way of doing things to the new way of doing things, I'm never going to be able to do it, right? I just won't do it. So when we built Oniro and assembled it, whether that's features, blocks, compliance envelope, artifacts, or processes, we've looked at adopting a market-driven approach. And that's what I think got us so fast so far. And we'll get into that in a second, right? So if I'm a device maker, those guys are really skeptical. Believe me, guy, I've worked for one of those, and I served many of those as customers in my past career. They'd be like, okay, so you're delivering me something that save money, no cost of switching, no lock-in. How are you going to do this? It's just not possible. I get the no lock-in, it's open source, but saving money, how? Show me the money. And then no cost of switching. Show me the decisions that you've taken. And this is where, I was talking about a market-driven development. So since the very first day, myself, my team, all of the other partners have been asking ourselves the question, how do we get devices in production on the shelf so that end user can try those devices and application creators can create applications, right? How do we get this started? And so we took a hard look at market analysis. We interviewed tens of companies across all of the segments of IoT and industrial IoTs, automotive, and so forth. And we've taken all requirements and grouped them and started developing functionality using the 20-80 rules, Pareto rules. So effectively, what are the 20% functionalities, build infrastructure, standards that we had to comply with that gets us 80% of that feature that address the 80% of the market requirements, right? And if you want, you can call that a common platform or a shin layer, right? It's just so far that you can go. If you start moving too high up the stack, you're going to be, not covering that 80%, right? So the more vertical you go, the deeper you go, the less broad you are. It's kind of intuitive, right? And then what have we done so far? We have effectively spent our time integrating to avoid cost of switching from existing technology to Oniro, and then creating opinionated defaults, effectively, the reference images, configuring those libraries that we collect together in a way that can be consumed, testing them via blueprints, testing, documenting, and building compliance and artifacts. No new development. And that's what we've done for the past 2 years. The new development was the new concept of a product-oriented, production-oriented project that has limited cost of switching so that we can get as many device makers and members to use it and save money in the process. Development will follow, right? But so far, we didn't have to because we wanted to be market relevant. And we deliberately chose this approach. And I'll address the areas of development that are going to be harder to tackle toward the end of this presentation. And of course, work on the infrastructure for CI, CD, and compliance artifacts. And Alberto, I think you're going to be talking about this tomorrow, right? So, oh, you talked about that yesterday. Yeah, so if you guys listen to Alberto talk, he was talking about, building an infrastructure that makes of license compliance and software bill of material something that is integrated with the development of an open source project. All right, so I guess it's time to go down the hole if you guys are ready to come with me. It's not going to be painful, I promise, but I think we're going to have to look at the 2080, those set of functionalities and standards that we found to be widely adopted by the industry, which we hope are going to be helping us to get as many devices shipped as possible. So number one, if we are to address as many use cases as possible, we need a modular, flexible build infrastructure that allows the project and the device makers that adopt the project, as well as the compliance guys that build artifacts out of the project, to combine, if you will, I use the analogy of Lego blocks, all of these Lego blocks into different type of Lego constructions, right? So we've talked with numerous potential partners, and 60–70% of the time, the infrastructure that is used today is bitbake. You guys are familiar with bitbake? Raise your hand. Yocto project, raise your hand. The Yocto project was founded in 2010, and the goal was to provide a set of common tools and libraries for silicon vendors to build their Linux embedded for their reference device, so that device makers would take the reference board from Intel, TI, Qualcomm, HiSilicon, and Huawei, and they would have the same embedded Linux SDK. In 1990s, early 2000, it wasn't like that. Each and every one of them had their own SDK, and it was very painful because if I had to build multiple production lines, I had to learn 10 different SDKs. So that was the goal of the Yocto project, right? It's now widely adopted across the industry. So it's the heart of the Yocto project, and it comes with a broad collection of Linux libraries and software. It's also been adopted by Linaro. If you guys are familiar with Linaro inside the Ledge project, which is a project inside Linaro that aims at creating a fully secure stack for embedded Linux devices that leverage the ARM architecture. And that gives us hardware scalability. It's also used by Intel and AMD. They all have their bitbake and Yocto project layers. And it has this layered architecture. I've used the word already before putting on the slide, but a layer is nothing more than a cake layer. Think of it as a folder, and they overlap one on top of each other. And the layer on top can add things, but also change things in the layer underneath. So that you have the Linux kernel, and then you have a set of patches for the Linux kernel for an SD micro device. You don't add a new kernel, you just provide the patches for the underlying Linux kernel that you're using, right? And then, up you go, the stack of layers. So these are the layers in the structure of Oniro today. So there's the build system that sits in its own layer. It's not a layer, it's the first, if you will, layer 0, bitbake. There's a set of Oniro recipes. These are things that pull together components for us to be able to build the supported images. The embedded core recipes, these contain things such as Linux, GCC toolchain, and all of the typical Linux libraries. There's hardware support layers. You see there Seco BSPs and Meta Seco. You see Meta RISC-V, Meta Intel, and yes, and Meta Raspberry Pi should be there as well. But all of these layers effectively enable hardware. And then documentation sits in its own layer. IP policy, Alberto, raise your hand, sits in its own layer. And then other RTOSes. Remember, Oniro has to address all kinds of use cases, Linux-based device, RTOS-based device. And system OTA. So over-the-air update software is layered using the bitbake architecture. All right, so number one, choosing the build infrastructure. The choice was bitbake, and so far, pretty much any device maker we talked to was like, yes, good thing, right choice. Oh, and openharmony. So we've taken the openharmony functionality out of the openharmony project. They provide us device interoperability, as Brian at the keynote today explained, and we package them as a bitbake layer, and it's plugged into Oniro. And this grants us device interoperability using that set of functionalities. We had to address device big and small. So the second next choice was, which kernels do we choose? And the choice was for Linux, currently 5.10 LTS. We're looking at 5.15 as well, but 5.10 is the kernel. For high-end devices, so Cortex-A, Intel, RISC-V, and Zephyr 3.1 for smaller devices in RTOS. This is the default. For those of you who don't know, Zephyr is a Linux Foundation project, and it's used by Linaro's Lite, which is the other project at Linaro that address lower-end devices. FreeRTOS is included as experimental. Again, supported versus experimental. Experimental means that it builds. There's a Meta FreeRTOS layer in there. You can build FreeRTOS devices, but we don't support that because we don't have device makers using FreeRTOS in production-oriented. So none of the device maker raised their hands and said, yes, we want FreeRTOS to be officially supported by the project, thus maintained, thus compliance artifacts and testing and reports and yada, yada, yada. And then LightOS, that comes as part of openharmony. LightOS is used in particular by Huawei in all of the consumer devices that are low-end, like the Buds, the Huawei MatePad, and so forth. All of those devices that have a Cortex-M use LightOS. So these are the kernels that are chosen by Oniro and have been chosen by Oniro so far. We call them build flavors. I don't know who came up with this word. Clearly, it wasn't me. I'm looking at somebody. Hardware support. So you had the build infrastructure that ties everything together. You have the kernels that you had selected for your big devices, medium devices, small devices. These things had to run on real hardware. Again, production oriented. What are the reference boards and the CPUs that are largely used by 80% of the market right there? And by enabling 10, maybe, we have covered 80% of the potential use cases. So we have taken Seco as one of the members of the working group, and Etro is not here today, but they have a couple of developers working in the project. They have a commercial off-the-shelf reference board that they use for all of the devices that they build for their customer, which is based on an NXP IMX8. This reference board has a Cortex-A plus Cortex-M, double CPU. On the A, they run Linux, and on the M, they run Zephyr. And then they also have an Intel gateway based on Intel Atom, and then they have a Rockchip device, Cortex-A, lower price. And then we have this plethora of simulators, so QEMU for 32 and 64, Intel ARM, and RISC-V. And we'll get to the maker's board in a second. And then we have experimental support for STMicro and Xilinx Cortex-A boards as well. Why experimental? Because these are companies that have showed interest in joining the project. And so the moment that they join the project, they share the cost of making these devices officially supported by the project. And then we'll also share the effort of helping us testing and building compliance artifacts. Everything that we do has to be ready by a device maker to be taken into production. We call it 60, 70% done, 80, 65, it doesn't matter, right? But not 20, because that's not enough for a device maker to say, yes, there's no cost of switching, yes, I'm saving money, yes, there's no lock-in. So that's been the goal and the driving factor for everything that we do. In general, if support for reference hardware, whether that's Zephyr, whether that's LightOS, whether that's a Linux-based device, if that support is present on the official Yocto project page or Zephyr page, it takes us about a couple of weeks to take that layer, include it into Oniro, enable the build, and come to the point that the board boots up without mistakes. And then, of course, there's the work of opinionated defaults, testing, compliance artifacts. But so long as a reference board is in one of those ecosystems that we have chosen to tap into, Zephyr, FreeRTOS, or Yocto project, is that quick for us to scale. And the only thing that we need is an input of a device maker that builds a device on a specific silicon or reference hardware from one of the supported suppliers. All right, let's go back to the dining philosophy. You guys remember, for now, I've been addressing just a production-oriented project for device makers, but we had to start building the brand for the end users as well. Because the end users, right, they will see devices out there, but they don't know what this device is run, Oniro, what it is. We don't get this ball rolling. So there's a particular category of users which are very influential. If you call, they are the influencers, right? It's a word that, you know, goes a lot nowadays. And they are the makers, right? So I think pretty much, I think 40% of us is probably a maker in the room, right? These are the guys who tinker with a Raspberry Pi or an Arduino and build stuff and test stuff, right? They kick the tires with a project, they contribute. Small patches, you know, it's their project in their free time, but they do contribute and they build a brand. Look, have you seen Oniro? It's pretty cool. I built this DJ virtual glove device using Oniro. It's pretty neat, right? That's what they do. And they usually use two things, Raspberry Pi and Arduino, right? So these boards are officially supported as well by the project. You don't use them in production, but the makers love them. They use them to test the project, run the project, see the compliance. I can have a Raspberry Pi with a software bill of material. How cool is that? Nobody would care, but yes. Isn't that true? Right, and test reports as well. Yes, but those are there specifically to address the makers and start building that brand inside that influential community. For interoperability, moving from, so build infrastructure, flavors and kernels, supportive hardware, support for makers, interoperability. So for interoperability, we've chosen to integrate the Project Matter SDK. Right, Stefan? It's done? Almost? Yes. But it's funny because Oniro might be one of the first reference OS, which is also Project Matter certified. I don't know how they call it, compliant, but you know, it's there as a reference OS. OpenThread for transparent gateway functionalities. openharmony that grants us device interoperability. Podman for containers. Modbus if you want to use Oniro in industrial IoT use cases. To control PLC is another kind of hardware on the factory floor. LVGL and Flutter for UI portability, and Rauk for system OTA. Right, so these, we're moving up the stack. And so far it's been easy enough, right? But it's gonna be harder later. Compliance envelope, verification and validation, right? This is not a big part in production. We elected to choose openchain and OpenSSF as our compass, North Star. We do generate software bill of material as part of our continuous license compliance. We have a dashboard for that, and we do that for all of these supported build flavor and configuration. If you want to know more about that, Alberto is there. And then we do have automatic decentralized device testing. We have a central node powered by Linaro Lava, which is what they use for their ARM devices. And then each of the partner, like Noitech Park, Kalpa, Huawei, Seiko as well, we have Lava nodes. So you can have your own Lava node for Oniro at your specific device, and that's going to show among all of the possible devices that you can choose to test Oniro. So myself from Milano can choose a device in Warsaw, build Oniro, and send my OS image there in Warsaw, and it's going to be tested on a device that I might not have on my desk. So that's the goal. And for lifecycle, and then we're moving to the end. Remember, predictable lifecycle, we have elected to have one release a year, and that should usually come with an update kernel, toolchain runtime, and new hardware support. And that's part of a discussion that we do with the community, the project, as well as the working group. 3 years maintenance for each of the release with decremental service level agreement. That's what they call in the commercial software industry. So first year we fix everything. Second year we fix critical and high priority bugs. Third year we only fix critical bugs, including toolchain and all components. And then members might elect to actually have an extended life cycle as part of their membership, right? Because they're financing the project with money. So members kind of help each other by extending that. And members also might get tailored software bill of material for their specific production. So as opposed to reference images, tailored bill of material for their device that go on the market. So far so good. We've used a market-centric approach that has given us speed and tools. We've basically leveraged what the industry has done in terms of work around the individual components. We only had to do the work of assembling those components and taking a production-oriented approach. And then most of the time we spent integrating, testing, documenting, and releasing, as you guys have seen. And so far we try to address effectively 2 gaps. One is technical, breadth of devices, collection of libraries not vertically integrated to address big, medium, and small devices, as well as a business gap. Device makers spending most of their time still on a commodity area to prototype open source bits. And we wanted to take and intake the cost into the Oniro project, hoping that that would mean that more members would come in and effectively share the cost with us. But the hard part is ahead. So far it's been mostly integration, but Oniro is a much more ambitious goal, which is that of having all devices powered by Oniro being interoperable one with each other, right? And then system OPDA and device authentication and device onboarding, and there's a lot of things such as using semantic web for device interoperability, managing devices and updates in the field. We haven't done that yet. We started, but it's a lot of work. Blockchain, for instance, to be used for authenticated devices as opposed to a central authority that grants keys. Blockchain can be a good approach, and there's a partner, IoTX, that joined very recently that does that using their IoTX open source libraries. Production-ready performance. So far we do production-ready artifacts, but we don't look at performances comparing one device with the other, right? So that's another areas that we haven't even started tackling. And then more blueprints, contributions, users, supporters. So what I'm trying to say is I think we need more help from more partners, more users, more you, and that's why in this slide you have, right? You guys are not enough, but still more than, well, let's not count who was already part of the project. You would help. You could help. You could help. You could help. I know you. You've helped. All right, and with that, point your browser to those 2 pages. Big thanks for me for listening to the presentation, and we have a couple question time. 2 minutes to go, 3 minutes to go. If there's questions, raise your hand. No questions? I'm not going to call names today. Then, thank you guys.